So thank you everybody for joining us at different times in the world. Today, we wanted to have a conversation with Will Mitchell, who I'll introduce in a second, but I figured I would introduce myself first. I'm Elena Vidal, as I already mentioned, and I am an assistant professor at Baruch College. I recently got promoted to associate, so in about a month, I'll say something different, but for now, it's just assistant. Thank you for the clapping. I am actually one of students. I'm a former student of Will's. I'm currently a co-author of Will's. And that's how I ended up getting this gig, also because I'm in the STR executive committee. So without further ado, I think we're all here to have a conversation with Will, not to know who I am. So we'll get started. And we figured with Will, we will just keep it informal. And we would just start with, this is Will Mitchell, and he is a professor at Toronto. So Will, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, Elena, former student, current co-author, and then most importantly, friend. Thank you so much. And thank you to STR, Asim, Samina, everybody involved in this. You folks are just doing an amazing job it's funny because it's partly a service to the community to engage us all. It's partly raising the profile of STR to really establish it as an institution. And it's just, I really can't overstate how valuable this is. We're so much more connected now than we were a year ago. And the pandemic is awful. I mean, there's no other word to describe it other than maybe some worse words than that. But it's forcing us to do some things and creating incentives to do things that I guess are the little bit of shining light in the midst of all the clouds of the pandemic. So thank you for shining those lights. I'm a faculty member at Toronto. I'm also an affiliated position at Duke University Med School. I've been on the faculty here. I've been on the faculty at Duke. I've been on the faculty at the University of Michigan. A bunch of years ago, I started my PhD at the University of California at Berkeley. I think I'm in the 38th year of my PhD program at this point. I do a bunch of research and teaching and service and that sort of stuff. I mean, I could go into detail, but why don't you just ask anything you're interested in asking about?
So to make it, the idea I think is also to get to know you a little bit better as a person. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in an area of British Columbia called the West Kootenays. The main town in that area is a town called Trail, and main town means it has 6,000 people. My village had 1,500 people. I went to school there, and then I worked in the sawmills for a while. I worked in the worked for the Forest Service for a while. I worked in the lead smelter for a while, and decided that maybe working 7 days, 2 off, 7 afternoons, 2 off, 7 graveyard, 3 off, and never knowing what time it was. Maybe I wanted to go to school after all. So I went to Vancouver to go to
school. Interesting, because I think based on my recollections as a PhD student with you, you were traveling so much that probably you still do a lot of graveyards without knowing it. You're just in Singapore and it's daytime there.
Yeah, but I get to choose them.
Good point. So how did you decide to go from that path into, what pushed you into a PhD program?
I was working in some community organizations and got angry at work. Decided I'd go back to school to get some more skills, and had the good fortune to go to a school, Simon Fraser, that had research active faculty and no full-time MBA program. So the research active faculty were teaching in the undergraduate program. And I started talking to a few of my professors, and it was like this light bulb going off. Wow, you can do that, and you can get paid for it. You get to ask the questions rather than somebody else asking the questions, and and it was really stunning seeing what people were doing and what the opportunities were. So I stayed, went back to school, and just never left.
Interesting, because I feel like that was similar to the path that I took. Like, we had some research active faculty in my undergraduate program, and that's how I became fascinated. I was like, oh, I didn't even know you could do a PhD in business, or so that's really cool. So what was your PhD like?
Fast and furious and varied. I started out thinking I was going to study worker co-ops because that's where I've been working. Discovered there were more people studying worker co-ops than there were doing worker co-ops, which is not a good balance. was working on an RA ship with Susan Foote on medical equipment. Discovered this really cool world of medical imaging. Was hanging out with David Teese and Ollie Williamson and Dick Nelson and Sid Winter and others, and discovered that, and John Freeman and others in Glenn Carroll and others in ecology, and discovered there's this really interesting mix on the one hand of empirical stuff going on with medical imaging, which is just really cool. And on the other hand, theory stuff with some combination of transaction cost economics, evolutionary economics, and ecological theory. And I realized combining theories of adaptation with theories of no change is kind of weird and odd, but it sort of worked. And just had a really, and just sort of fell into this, it was just this really rich environment, both empirically because it was one of the centers of the world for science and medical imaging with MRI, and especially with MRI. And it was also one of the center of the world for cool theory, and it was able to put the two things together and come up with something that was kind of weird but worked.
So I know that there's some early. Oh, somebody has a question. Oh, so following up on that, I know that there's some early stage doctoral students in the meeting, and I'm sure they would love to know, how did you pick your dissertation topic?
Complete and total randomness and serendipity. I was working with Susan. She was studying as an RA. She was studying regulation of medical imaging. I discovered this cool technology. Ollie Williamson was sort of floating through the place, and David Teese was there full time when he was there. And so there was some ideas around transaction costs, and maybe I can put transaction costs together with medical imaging and see what I can get with it. And spent 2 years putting up data and 4 years figuring out the theory, and sort of got there.
I remember you saying that by then you still had to use punch cards to go to the library to be able to run things, right?
No, I was post punch cards.
Oh, okay.
I've never actually used a punch card. Simon Fraser was a small university, so it adopted batch processing early. And so actually I've never had to use a punch card. But I started out thinking I could record it as on a piece of paper, these big synoptic accounting spreadsheets, pieces of paper, like, I don't know, 17 by 11 or something like that. And I thought I could record all the concepts and data on that, and quickly discovered that was wrong. So I started using some early mainframe spreadsheets, sortable things, and Elena, you've had the misfortune of trying to work with that data, so you know how messy it was.
Yeah, it was very messy, but it was during my first year of the PhD program, and it was fascinating to see the value that was in that data. So it was a really cool exercise as a first year doc student.
Yeah, I mean, I won't pretend it was thought out. It was just initially it was a data dump. Just put a whole bunch of stuff together and see what patterns I could get out of it. But then eventually it got a little bit more disciplined in terms of theory. And I started off thinking it was transaction cost theory, and then eventually discovered it was evolutionary theory. But that was okay.
So if you had to give some type of advice to doctoral students at the early stage, since we're talking about your dissertation, what would that advice be?
Start early. I don't know, some sort of sequential commitment. Get an idea, build on it, change it if you need to, but only if you need to. Have fun with it, own it. We were talking this morning when we kicked off, something I wish I'd done this a long time ago. A couple of years ago, I started doing gaps tables for the work, for my work, where I write down the concepts I was working with and what the people who are working with those concepts had concluded about them, in the context in which I was studying, and then do a second column in the table where I write down what they don't know, where the gaps are, and then a third column where I sort of eventually figure out what how my hypotheses or my research questions, depending which way I'm going, are going to help fill the gaps. And that's helped give me some discipline, because it means I'm not all over the place, because there's only so much you can put in one table. And because I know many of you, some of you at least have heard me say this before, that, you've got a combination, there's a 3-part combination, and this is true of any paper, and it's certainly true of a dissertation, in that you have an audience, you have a research question, and you have a set of methods. And, and it has to be a research question that is interesting to the audience, and it has to be a set of methods that provide an answer that meet the norms of reliability for that audience. So I guess the starting point really is knowing who the audience is. And then making sure your question fits that audience, and if it doesn't, find another audience, and making sure your methods fit that audience, and if they don't, find either different methods or different audience. Because in simple examples, if you send a paper that's not identified to management science, you might as well send a rejection letter along with it, because it'll save everybody a lot of time. Whereas if you send a paper that starts off with, let me tell you about my identification strategy to ASQ, you might as well send the rejection letter along with that, because they don't care nearly as much. And so start with the audience. And for me, audience is people, right? It's not the ecological theory or transaction cost theory. It's it's the specific individuals within that area.
So to follow up with that, I know that you did a lot of work with your dissertation. How many papers did you publish out of that? I remember having this conversation in our first year doctoral seminar.
Yeah, it was a bunch. I've lost track. I have to admit, I ran out of patience with it before I ran out of potential papers. There's still probably a few potential papers sitting in the data because it was so messy, and as a result, there's so much there. It basically, in some sense, it started off with 2 core papers that were in my dissertation, and I thought I wrote them both as papers in the dissertation. And then they ended up being total. I submitted both of them, one to SQ and one to SMJ, and they eventually got published. But boy, as a result of the review process, and I got fortunate in having both good reviewers and thoughtful editors. Reviewers who were willing to be obnoxious. One anonymous reviewer named Marvin Lieberman, who were both obnoxious is the wrong word, particularly in Marvin's case. Who are willing to be really demanding, but at the same time open-minded, taking it from my perspective rather than theirs, and telling me what was, why I wasn't accomplishing what I thought I was accomplishing, but then giving me the space to do that, and then having editors, in one case Dan Schendel, in the other case John Freeman, who weren't taking votes, but were working with me and the reviewers to help me get someplace. And that, I have to admit, that's one of the biggest messages in my life, and I've tried to carry that, my professional life, is I've tried to carry that through with the editing work I've done, that editors need to be developmental and definitely not count votes. And reviewers need to take an author's point of view. They need to be tough-minded and push you really, really hard to do what you want to do. But it's not a reviewer's job to say, if I were doing this paper, this is what I would, this is how I would study it. It's a reviewer's job to say, you've told me what you sort of told me what the question is. Tighten that up, and let's make sure that that you're accomplishing it. And I've edited and reviewed a lot now for a long time, and I've tried, that those first 2 papers really drove that home to me, and I've tried to take that to heart in my own work.
So how has that? So from there, how did that influence your trajectory for publishing future research?
I think both papers made me get the theory right, or righter at least. And I went into it. Some of you heard me make the distinction between red state and blue state. I went into it as sort of a proto-red state scholar who sort of took theory seriously, but mainly cared about the empirics. And the review process made me take the theory seriously as well. And in one case, it was a blue state paper. The SQ paper was a blue state paper. Here's transaction costs. Let's use this cool stuff from medical imaging to help us learn something more about transaction cost theory. At least I thought it was. I realize now, actually, the words I was using for transaction costs were actually much more evolutionary theory. And if I was to describe it now, it would be a blue state paper about evolutionary theory informed by ecology and transaction costs, rather than transaction cost informed by ecology and evolutionary. But in any case, it made me take the theory a lot more seriously. And then the SMJ paper was a red state paper. started out mainly empirical, but it made me understand how even an empirical paper has to be framed in terms of theory, right? If I'm trying to fill a hole in an empirical in an empirical gap, in that case around entry timing, it's not very effective to do it just as an empirical story without really thoughtful framing from theory. So whether I care about the empirics first or the theory first, you've got to have theory. And in my point of view, from my approach to things, anyways, if you care about theory first, I think it's better if you have data as well. So those two papers took a fair while. I got fortunate in them, and it really helped me see why every paper really needs an incredibly strong mix of theory and data, whether it's led with one or led with the other.
Yeah, I think even to this day, I remember having this conversation in my first year doctoral program about, I don't know, a long time ago, 14 years ago. But it still seems that every time I start a new paper, I try to think about it in those terms. Is it a blue state paper or a red state paper? So it does help. If you had to name one contribution that you've done to the field or to research, not to the field, because we'll talk a little bit more about that next, but to research, what would your main contribution be?
The list of names that Richard put in the chat box, plus all the others.
Many others, probably.
Yeah, I've been on about 70 dissertation committees at this point, about half of maybe 35 or 40 of those as chair or co-chair, and the other half is the others committee members. That's far and away the work that matters. Working with people, getting personal benefit out of it, helping, seeing how ideas that I would never have thought of develop. That's the valuable part.
So you've been in over 70 dissertations?
Yeah.
And I think many more. I think one of the things that I remember most, or that it was interesting to me as a first year doctoral student or second year going to conferences, was seeing you interacting with the doctoral students. And even during social opportunities, it was always about, like, you always had a time to dedicate to the doctoral students. Even I remember you used to drive with us sometimes to conferences. If they were in DC, you would take a drive with us. And I remember it was like 9 p.m. We had been driving for 4 hours, and Will would be asking us questions like, okay, so what would be the first sentence of your dissertation? And you're driving in the middle of the highway and you're tired and you're having to think about these things. But it was always an interesting exercise. So I as in a very biased way, I also agree that has been one of your a great contribution that you've done, just being there for the following generations, some of which are a lot of us, I think, are here.
Well, Xiaoxu, you had to put up with it. Yeah. And Samina, you had to put up with it. It's I mean, it's a way of creating, actually at heart, it's a way of creating really strong friendship. And people that you know personally, intellectually, and people who've accomplished things that I could never even have begun to imagine accomplishing. It's really cool.
And I think you've cast a network of academic siblings that I think it's been an interesting way of thinking about it. I never thought academia would be this way, but there's been some type of brotherhood or sisterhood with people that you share experiences with. I think we were talking with Tamina about this in a different setup, how we had similar experiences just because you were both of our advisors, like having a 5-hour-long meeting and not really thinking about, like, I need to use the bathroom and not being able to go. Yeah,
Laurence claims that she always brought a large suitcase to the airport in case I showed up with my motorcycle and to give her a ride home.
Yeah, you're quite the character, and I think it's allowed us to share some of those experiences with each other. I before we transition to more on the career side, in terms of research, do you see any unanswered questions that doctoral students or junior faculty should be thinking about? What do you think are the big questions?
Whatever you find interesting and convince somebody else. Interesting, big question, bigness and interestingness are endogenous, right? I don't think there's some sort of latent pool of interesting questions out there or big questions out there. I think there are questions that we convince our colleagues and the profession and broader set of stakeholders in the practicing community as well, that they're big. And so I actually think the responsibility for making something big is ours. You know, if we see a question that we think is intriguing and can convince somebody that it's our job to convince, you know, a relevant audience that it matters. And that's what makes it big. You know, and obviously right now there's, you know, think about, you know, the number of questions that have been surfaced because of some combination of COVID, racial, you know, racial concerns about racial inequality, concerns about globalization and the attacks that are happening on globalization, the moving forward and moving backwards in market-based economies and political openness. And it's really, and just on that last one, it's really interesting. And we see all the backward movement in places like the US and Hungary and Poland and Israel. And at the same time, there's other countries that are moving forward. In fact, if you use them both in market base, both in terms of their market base and in terms of their political openness. And so we're actually in a really interesting period with things going both forwards and backwards in different countries over different times. So are there questions, you know, in that myth of racial inequality, globalization, and pandemics, and all the stuff that's associated with the supply chains and so forth that are associated with that, are there big questions in there? There's more big questions than we can possibly stir. You know, so it's basically our job as scholars to pick one and convince the world that this is the one, that this is one of the ones that we should be paying attention to right now.
Yeah, and I think that reminds me of trying to figure out like papers or like path to my dissertation and what the contribution should be. And, you know, I remember you pushing us really a lot to think beyond what was or what had been done in the literature and saying like, well, no one's done this, or papers haven't really looked at this particular thing, and really thinking beyond that, like, okay, so no one's done it, but beyond, why is this interesting and why is this important? And us not knowing this should fill some type of gap, other than, yeah, that's, you know, no one's done it, but that doesn't mean that it's interesting or important or relevant to research.
Yeah, the why, but even more the who, right? Who would that be interesting to? And, you know, some of you have heard me make the analogy of standing on top of you know, a lot of the times I have fallen into the trap of standing on top of a mountain with a megaphone and yelling and hoping that somebody will hear me. And discovering that in fact I'm standing on top of a molehill inside a canyon, and I'm yelling and it's bouncing off the walls, and, you know, I can't even hear it because it's echoing. It needs to be a quiet conversation, right? It's sitting at a seminar table with the 4 or 5 people around at the table who you think are most central to it. And some of them may be live, some of them may be dead, some of them may be brain dead, but they're the people who, ideally a mix of at least 2 of those, right? Some iconic people, like an Edith Penrose or an Ollie Williamson or whoever, and some people working at the frontier of the field. And having 4 or 5 of those people sitting imagine having 4 or 5 of those people sitting at the conference table with you and explaining why they should take it seriously. And if I can, and I will say for myself, where I failed, it's when it starts with, I don't know who specifically should be sitting at that table and why they should be there together.
Yeah, and I think even at seminars, I remember you even asking the question of like, why is this important to the speaker, and like almost catching them off guard. And I think it's a very important question and yeah, I mean, thinking about who your audience is. So in that line, I mean, it seems like that would be great advice for junior scholars, but do you have any other advice along those lines that would carry weight for people like me and like Xiaoshu and others that are starting our careers?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I think we're all junior scholars. As long as we continue to be scholars, we're junior scholars, right? Because scholarship is surfacing new ideas and helping people understand why they're important and exploring the boundaries of that. And if we fall into the trap, whether we're 1 year out or 40 years out, of just doing the same thing over and over again, we're no longer scholars. So we're all junior scholars. And that really means constantly knowing what the question is, knowing who the people are that care about the question, knowing what they already believe about the question, knowing what they don't know about the question, and will agree that they don't know about the question, and then figuring out something I can say that each of us can say that will help that audience come to a new understanding. And it may be a light bulb going off, oh, boy, I didn't know that, or it may be something where they already know that there's a gap and we're going to fill it. But that's our job as scholars. It's the question, the audience, knowing the literature well enough to know what they know, knowing the literature even better to know what they don't know, being able to convince some smart, arrogant people that they don't know something. And none of us in this room are arrogant, but we all have colleagues. We have all once or twice in our careers bumped into a colleague who is, and they're usually our reviewers. And so we have to know the literature well enough and be able to articulate it well enough to help them say, when we say, this is a field that you've been engaged in, and here's something you don't know, that they'll agree with that. And then getting something focused and crisp that we can say, here's an important contribution to the body of knowledge that you're part of. And that's scary, right? Because it's essentially taking our clothes off, right? And we make our, we're making our intellect naked, taking our hat off at least, and putting our ideas out there, on the table, in the air, on paper, electronically, and saying, this is what I think, and you should care about it. And that's scary, because we're really every single paper, every single presentation is taking a risk. Who still gets scared when you're going to do a presentation, right? I mean, and you should be, right? This is like acting. You should throw up before you go on stage. And because it matters, right? And it's got to matter in your gut. If it's worth standing up and talking about it, whether you're, and so it's, and Elaine, I know you've heard this, Shashu, Samin, I know you've both heard this. It's like doing a present, how you do a paper and then you do a presentation based on the paper, and you go into the paper and you realize that the logic that you thought was in the paper, or you just assumed was in the paper, isn't there, and you're starting to put it on some slides, and you discover that, you've jumped from A to C without going through B. And once you go through B, you discover that A doesn't connect to C in the way you thought it did. Does that sound familiar to anybody? And when you do a presentation, it shows up because you only got a few slides, and it's hard to lie, or it's hard to hide it in a bunch of words. And that's obviously that's the value of doing presentations, right? Is to figure that out and then go back in and change the paper so that A goes to B goes to C prime. And think in a real sense, that's one of the glories of our field, right? That we can stand up in front of an audience and tell them what we think and try to convince them that what we think matters to them, as opposed to a consulting job or a business executive job, where for the most part, you're doing what you're filling in holes in what somebody else thinks. We get to ask the questions. Consultants don't, business executives don't for the most part. Even CEOs are amazingly constrained. But by the same time, that gives us the responsibility to make sure that what we think is logical. And sometimes, right now, in some cases, it's really obvious how risky that is. Think about COVID, and think about people like Tony Fauci, who is doing a good job of saying what he thinks, and is getting death threats. Most of us are not in that situation, but we could be. Who knows whether what we're working on might turn out to, just by happen chance, to be central to a globalization debate. I mean, how many of us can imagine doing a piece of research that said something really relevant to the current debates around globalization? And how many of us could imagine having somebody pick up on that and hate it? And so in the beginning, it means just be right, or as right as we possibly can. I don't know about the death threat part of it.
So on that note, I think it's one of the things that, we're always focused about our research, but I think one thing that, for that to happen, for our work to be relevant to others, it would have to be read by others. So how do you make that transition between your papers in academia to actually getting to the industry? Because I know you have a lot of industry connections and a lot of, you have a foothold in that area. So I think that's also important. How did you get to that point?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I would argue that most of our communication, whether it's in academics or outside academics, is not through the written word, right? By the time that something gets published, we've presented it multiple times at our schools, at conferences, and seminars, and workshops. And the people who are most central to it, and the people who are sort of going to pick up on the ideas and use the ideas, already know them by the time it gets published. And the paper, in many ways, is just kind of an imprimatur. It's setting a stamp on the fact that we've sort of reached a point where what we've said, what we've been saying for the last, we're talking at the beginning, 9 years, papers can sometimes take, as some of us know, can take 9 years or more. Elena, you and I have taken a long time on some of our work. Samina, you and I have taken a long time on some of our work. Olga Hahn, who was Olga Voronina when she came in with you, is now Olga Hahn. We started working on a project on the Dow Jones
Sustainability Index.
Sustainability Index, and I think it was the first year of her PhD program, and I thought it was maybe going to help her get her second year paper, and then I thought it was maybe going to help her get a job, and then I thought it maybe it would help her get promoted to her first promotion, and now I think it's going to help her get tenure, because that's how long it took, literally. So by the time it gets published, the people who care about it have already read it, or you already heard it. And the same thing's true actually with the work I do with B's and C's, with business executives and consultants. For the most part, they don't read my stuff, and I do publish some things in the applied press, in HMPI and HBR and the like, and some of that has an impact. But for the most part, it's making connections with people and talking with them. Right. So, I mean, I know people at some of the consulting companies, and we talk about things, and I learn from them, and they learn a little bit from me. And it's, maybe some of it shows up in writing, but that's actually more of an outcome than a cause. Or I just had a call this morning with some friends, with somebody I know well, in another country, about a possible commercialization exercise. And that's using value chain integration as sort of the frame for developing the strategy. And that started as a conversation. Then it went to reading the work I've done on value chain integration. And then it came back to the conversation because the work that I'd written on VCI really gave some words, which is important, but it doesn't fully give the logic, because every individual strategy is solving a particular problem, and whereas a piece of research is establishing a general pattern. And so it gave us some words, but the conversation we're having this morning was much more around how do we make this work in this particular context? And so whether it's an academic setting or whether it's a practical setting or BC setting or policy setting, I think it comes down to establishing relationships. And some of those come through our students, right? I mean, we have the amazing good fortune to be teaching at schools where people go off and work. And so each of us, from the very beginnings of our careers, are creating networks with initially dozens and eventually hundreds and thousands, literally, of people who are in business positions or in policy positions, there's 200 countries in the world, they're probably in 199 of them. There must be some, I suspect that each of us has a country where we don't have a connection, but a first order connection or a second order connection, but that's about it. And so it's the personal relationships that we build with people that do that. I mean, in fact, the VCI example I had this morning, that relationship started off with a term paper that somebody wrote in one of my classes about some ideas he had for his family business, about how to expand it. And over the years, I've developed a really close relationship with him, with his brother, with his father, with other people in the business, and and those ideas have developed. But again, it's built on relationships.
So what do you think would be the, changing gears a little bit, what have been the biggest challenges in your career?
Time, lack thereof, right? There's three things that matter in life: family, health, and time. Everything else is fungible. I've had the good fortune to have an incredibly supportive family. I've had the good fortune to keep my health most of the time. So time, it's pretty brought home to me right now. I'm running 2 MBA programs in the middle of a pandemic, and so everything we knew, or much of what we knew, has gone out of the window. So trying to make sure that there's time to do that, so that the students get what they need, and my colleagues get what they need, and I get what I need for the research, can be a pain in the ass. But I'm not. But having said that, I'm not complaining.
So what would be the opposite of that? What have been some of your biggest triumphs, you think, throughout your career?
I'll just come back to the list of students. The opportunities to work with really interesting people and see every single one of them do really interesting things.
It's funny how you mentioned, the biggest constraint has been time, because you are so generous with your time. I think I remember as a doctoral student that we would have, 8-hour-long meetings just on my research, and it's just amazing how you managed, you would fit that into that time constraint.
Yeah, I mean, I can't do this as much as I used to, but Warren Zevon has a song that goes, "Sleep When I'm Dead." Now Warren died young, so there are some problems with that. A lot of it boils down to figure out what matters and spend the time on the things that matter and get rid of the things that don't. How Willie Ocasio has the attention-based, theory of management. There's this, limited number of things you can pay attention to. Pick the ones that matter to you and do them. And just don't do the stuff that doesn't matter.
So one of the things that you mentioned is that there's 3 things: family, health, and time. But within those 3 things, I think it's important to also have some type of, I think family is really important. I know family matters a lot to you, and just on the family or the non-work side, what are your main hobbies? I think I know one of them.
Yeah, somebody asked me that question about 6 months ago, and I thought for a moment, I realized it's putting up weird data sets. I have several dozen data sets that I maintain, longitudinal data sets that I maintain, in bankruptcies and acquisitions and pharma and med tech and health IT and the like, and auto. And if I'm just brain dead and I can't do anything else, I'll just sit down at 3 screens and update a data set. And some of them I get to use for research, some of them I get to use for teaching, some of them I just get to look at because they're cool, because they're cool and see the patterns emerge over time. But that's just a really, I don't know, I just find it a really comforting activity.
So the one that I was thinking about was guitars. I know you have a little bit of a collection of guitars, or you used to at least.
Oh, I still do. I brought 2 more home yesterday. I went out to British Columbia. I went out to empty my mother's house in BC, and there were 3 of my guitars were there, plus 1 amplifier. I managed to leave 1 guitar behind, which I gave to my nephew. But so I now have 2 more guitars and 1 more amplifier in the basement.
Can we ask how many guitars you have, or is that not?
I don't want to say.
So some of you know I'm married to a musician too. So we have, he's a drummer. So unfortunately, guitars would be a much more concise thing to carry around. We have about 2 or 3 drum kits just sitting in storage for someday.
And drum kits, of course, can explode because you can keep adding 1 more thing to them.
Yeah, I don't know how many cymbals we have lying around.
Right.
We even have a cymbal as a clock in our kitchen.
I love it.
I fully get it. And it's so easy to collect. I mean, every time he's like, "Oh, there's this big sale on this new kit," and I'm like, "Where are we gonna put it? We already don't have. We live in a tiny New York City apartment. You can probably hear my daughter in the other room screaming."
I will say I really like, we were talking earlier, I really like hearing kids on these calls. I I mean, A, because kids are fun, and B, it's a really good reminder that we're human. It's actually been one of the pluses of all the Zoom calls that we've been doing. It's just seeing and hearing and family.
Yeah, she's also starting to learn how to walk, or stand up rather, which means she's just banging her head on anything that she stands up and she automatically bangs her head with something. So I'm sorry for the background noise, but it's part of.
Music is a bit like a data set. You just get so involved in it that you can't think about anything else, right? I mean, if you're trying to work through a melody line, or you're trying to work through the fingering for something, you can't think about anything else or it doesn't work. And data sets the same way. If you lose traction on sort of how the pieces fit together, it all comes tumbling down. And both of those I actually just find really lovely ways of getting away from the irritating stuff into the stuff that where I have a lot more control.
So I remember, for most of us, I think when we're working on those data sets, we actually play music. I remember you used to listen to baseball games. Is that still the case? Are you still listening to baseball games where you're working?
Yeah, well, I followed about 5 games yesterday. I mean, the baseball season has just started. We'll see how long it lasts. It may fall apart. Florida Marlins had 4 cases of COVID yesterday. They've expanded the rosters to 30. They may have to expand them to 60 in order to keep to be able to play. Yeah, I like it. Baseball is this lovely thing. We're unlike hockey, which I pay attention to, where you have to follow it all the time. Baseball is so slow that you can pay attention to something else and then come back and you completely understand where it was and how it got there.
Mina, just in terms of timekeeping, we're at 9:50. Should we continue for 10 more minutes and then we'll do Q&A?
Yep, that sounds good.
Okay, so, I may need a minute. What happened?
Yay.
Hello.
Oh, how nice.
You want little Ellie.
Hey,
Ellie wanted to meet everybody. Okay, see, mommy's in a work call.
How nice,
okay.
Ellie, how nice to see you and how nice to hear you.
Okay, is that better? Okay. Sorry about this, guys.
Can you hear my cat? Can you hear my cat who's responding to Ellie?
Oh, the kitty cat wants to say hi. Okay, this is better. Well, how did you, since we're on this topic, how did you manage, being so productive while having 3 kids?
I have a partner who's even more productive.
I remember she was doing her PhD while we were doing our PhD.
Yeah, she did. When our youngest child started school, she did her master's, and then and went from there to do her PhD. And was doing her PhD while we had kids. Partly that, partly you've got your daughter sitting on your lap. When my kids were about 6, I started taking them to conferences. In fact, I was going down to the academy. The year was in Cincinnati. I left the house and was driving down to Cincinnati because from Ann Arbor to Cincinnati is not that far. And I thought I would drive. And I got about, 10, 15, 20 miles out of town. I thought, why am I going down here by myself? So I turned around and came back and said, this is pre-cell phone, so I couldn't call, and said, I'm going to take Myri and Tamsin with me to Cincinnati. Let's get them dressed and pack a few clothes and let's go. And let's make sure that Luke doesn't wake up so that he doesn't notice that they're leaving. Because I could handle 2, but I couldn't handle 3. And he's still angry about that. And this is 30 years later, 25 years later, and he's still angry at me about it. But that in a funny way, that helps a lot. Going to conferences, traveling with me, I've taken kids to Singapore. They've all been to Africa, several different countries in Africa. They've all been to Paris. It just helped me get a better sense of who they were and where they were at a different point in time, sort of to be able to spend time with them, but also not spend time. I had made trade-offs. They had made trade-offs. There's no ambiguity about that. There's a saying in my family that when somebody asks me how long I'm going to take, when am I going to be finished, I always say an hour, and it has 0 information content. Once in a while, once in a very, very blue moon, it's less than an hour, and many times it can be all night. And there's there has been a price with that. I mean, there are times when I haven't spent time with my kids I wish I had spent.
Yeah, I know there's been more than a couple times that we've been at a meeting and your wife would call and say like, oh, what time are you going to be home? And you would say an hour. An hour goes by, an hour and a half goes by. We're still working on this data set. And then 2 hours go by and she calls again. So what time are you going to be home? Oh yeah, in an hour. And it just kept going. And then it was 8 or 9 o'clock. And, you know, at some point you were like, okay, I think it's time to call it a night. I think it was probably the 3rd or 4th time. And, you know, I was just so amazed that your wife would never get mad at you.
Yeah, I'm incredibly fortunate that way.
And I guess she was used to it as well.
Yeah, for whatever reason. I mean, we just spent 5 days together in the car driving to BC and 6 days driving back, and it was, and frankly, it was wonderful. It's actually very nice to be trapped with someone you love a lot, in the front seat, two front seats of a car, and have the opportunity to, you know, to spend time talking with each other, which you don't normally have.
That is very true. So that's good advice. I think my husband knows exactly what you're going to be what your wife is going to go through at some point, just because the poor thing has been taking care of Ellie all morning. Okay, you want to play with the computer? I know. This is so much fun. So I guess we'll jump into the questions in a second, but I guess the last one thing that I wanted to ask you is, I think I had the privilege, so did Samina and others in this call, to have you as a mentor and an advisor. So if you had to give others that didn't have that privilege and that honor, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I don't think I'm very good at advice. I think I'm reasonably good at doing stuff. I'm not that good at telling people what to do. Mainly it's find something and stick to it. Change when you have to be adaptable, but be sequentially adaptable, and spend the time it needs. And that's, you know, whether you're an advisor or whether you're a student, just spend the time it needs. And with doctoral, I mean, every doctoral relationship is different, right? I mean, this with an MBA program, there's kind of standard patterns, and it varies a little bit from student to student. But there's so many MBA students, and the half-life is so short that it's hard. I mean, I've got one MBA student right now who I'm pretty close to, who we make time to talk about lots of things. But for the most part, those are fleeting. Doctoral relationships are long. They're lifelong, actually, and every one of them is different. And if you try to impose one pattern on another, you know, something that worked by, you know, good luck or good happen chance on one, and you try to impose on another, it fails. So just figure out what it needs and do it.
That's really interesting, because Eric, even in my cohort, you led the dissertation for all 3 of us, me, Nell, and Olga. We all graduated from our PhD at the same time, and I think the support that you gave each of us was different based on what we needed at the time. So we were just extremely lucky to have you there, even though you left after our 3rd year. So
yeah.
So yeah, I could see how Luke would get upset at the fact that you would just leave.
Yeah, that was very cool, because you're right. You came in at the same time. If I remember correctly, all 3 of you stayed with Dilys and me, and again the kids for a few days while you're getting settled in Ann Arbor. You worked together really closely. You did 3 dissertations that were hugely different. You graduated on the same days. Literally, you know, I do remember we strung the three defenses together, one after the other. And it's a good example. You're just different individuals, intellectually, emotionally, all of the above. And one thing I think helped was, in each case, if I remember correctly, there was a co-chair, and there was a different co-chair in each of the three dissertations, and that's certainly something I do a lot. Not so much to spread the work, but to make sure that the ideas don't get too narrow. You know, so I've done a co-chair here with Ann Bowers on one dissertation that went really well. I've done a co-chair with Tim Rowley, again, that really went really well. And in both cases, we got the students got hugely dissertations than they would have got had it just been with me, or just been with Tim, or just been with Ann. And you have to pick the people you're working with to make sure that, you know, that you can be compatible and not push somebody off in different directions. But I think it's valuable.
Yeah, and I think I mean even to this day, I think it's been a valuable experience to have had the PhD with both Olga and Nell, and we still work together. And I think one of the other advice that you gave us was always to be in touch with research and what makes you a better researcher is just presenting your work and getting your work out there, and changing things and adapting to what needs to be done, while still trying to be true to your ideas.
Yeah.
So we are almost on the hour. So I was gonna take a screenshot before before we move on to the Q&A session, if that's okay with everybody who has a video. Maybe you can smile a little bit.
So Elena, I was going to ask everyone who's appropriately dressed from the waist up, if you could show your video, that would be great. It looks a lot better on our YouTube channel and on our Twitter feed.
And I will say, I think we've all learned one of the lovely things about Zoom is being able to see eyeballs.
Yeah.
We're actually closer to each other than we would be in a seminar room or in a classroom. And that's turned out that there's a real plus in that. It's quite cool.
And I think based on my attendance to conferences and PDWs, and it creates a different, it provides an opportunity for I've seen some chat rooms that are incredibly helpful, especially with doctoral students presenting. You have this array of questions that otherwise, they're just coming up as you're presenting that you wouldn't have at a regular presentation at academy or anything else, because there's a more structural setting. So I think it's been quite a few positives from doing this.
Yeah, and there isn't a back row or a hidden corner the way there is in a classroom or a seminar room. We're all in the front row, at least through the first 49.
That's right. All right, so maybe if we could all look at the screen, I'll count to 3 and then everyone smile, okay? 1, 2, 3, cheese. All right, I think I got a good picture, Elena.
Okay, good. So let's move to the Q&A session. I think some of the questions are interesting, and they also flow from the conversation that we had now. One of the questions that I think a lot of people would ask is, how can you be so productive and publish so many papers? I think Xiaoshu was the original person who asked that, at least in this chat.
Have the smarts to pick good co-authors, many of whom start as doctoral students, not all, but many. I mean, Z, you and I've had the pleasure of working with you on the paper around institutional intermediation. And if I think about the combination of you and Gary and Druba, and I hope me, we've got really cool piece of work that's come because of the interaction among the 4 of us. I can't imagine I certainly can't imagine myself doing it by myself. And I can't imagine really any one of the 4 of us being able to do that piece of work, both theoretically and empirically, and in terms of methods. And so yeah, have good, have co-authors who, some sense, complement each other, but more just that you like working with.
Yeah,
I also
very,
Mm-hmm.
so I had a very strong impression when I look at your CV the first time while I was at Duke, that you, the rate you publish is much higher than a lot of the other scholars. So I'm just wondering, how do you manage, I guess, in your earlier stage, how do you manage so many projects at the same time and then publish at such a quick rate? Is just the co-authors, or is there any other secrets?
I probably fall on the spectrum someplace. I can focus on I can focus on things, and and get it to the stage that it needs, where it needs to be passed off, and then I can move on to something else. And frankly, I care. Publication, as I said earlier, publication by itself doesn't matter that much. It's an imprimatur, but I really care a lot about getting the ideas worked through to be able to know what I think and hopefully engage with others around what I think. I really, and again, it's one of the glories of this profession, is that we have the right and the responsibility to come up with a core idea and get it clean. Think about some of us have worked in consulting, and many of us know consultants. They just are getting to the nux of really figuring out what's going on, and the client stops paying and they have to go on and work for something else. And they never truly figure it out. or business problem that some really smart person is working on, and they're just beginning to figure it out, and then the technology changes, the competition changes, the regulation changes, the politics change, and all of a sudden everything they've done they throw away, and it's 6 months old and it's irrelevant, and they're picking up on something new. And we don't have to do that. We get it's our responsibility and luxury to be able to pick something and get it right.
So I think Richard had kind of a similar question about co-authorship. Richard, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, my question was, what does it mean to be a good co-author? And who have you observed being an especially good co-author, and what made them so good?
Probably two things: timeliness and really focusing on the ideas, and not just doing a cursory sort of light-handed run through it, but really drilling down into, not the whole thing, picking up one thing in the project that needs to be worked on right now, and really get down as deep as it can. And Elena, you and I have published together. Samina, you and I have published together. Z, you and I are working together. All three of you are great co-authors because all three of you do that. Am I missing anybody? Xiaoshu, you and I have not yet had the wonderful opportunity to work together, but that may well. I hope it does.
I think Mingzhi Chen was raising his hand on this one. Oh, you need to unmute yourself.
Elena, I truly love your boy. This boy, right?
What's that, Mingzhi?
Yeah. First, my apologies to Samina. Because I was at another meeting and I came back, and then so I can only turn my face, so I lose that golden moment. Perhaps let me speak from two perspectives. I think the first, Will and I are very much contemporary, so I have witnessed, firsthand throughout my career, how much, what kind of scholars that he has been, and the kind of role model that he has set for many doctoral students and researchers and his friends and colleagues like myself. And not only that, certainly I want to give the credit, perhaps it's because of a number. And I think Will, and to me, reminded me another, Michigan professor, Jim Westphal. I think two of them, from my viewpoint, are very much alike in that regard. And basically just have given their whole hearts, to the research and working with the doctoral student and so on and so on. And I think Richard raised a very interesting question, which I would like to hear from Will in terms of your view, because different colleagues have different views in terms of working with the doctoral students. And some of my colleagues always think that doctoral students will help to increase the productivity and so on and so on. And other set of professors and even disciplines say, I would not publish with my doctoral students until like the 5th years after his or her graduation. And I would not be writing together with my doctoral students in his or her dissertation. And personally, I made a completely different decision, because I very much consider, I'm a diehard strategic choice school of thought. So I decided not to work with any doctoral students almost throughout my career until the recent years. And because when I was a junior faculty member at Columbia, and even when I was a doctoral student at Maryland, And my two favorite professors compete, and they even fight, trying to get my teaching assistantship. So as a Chinese, I just walk away from working with the doctoral students. I think that is a very conscious decision. And because of that, I have become and developed a closer relationship with many doctoral students. So I was very involved in the doctoral consortium early in my career. And then I also created quite a few academic communities and working with the doctoral students. So I would be interested in your thoughts that what would be a good advice in taking into account all the different, intellectual and educational and even political considerations in terms of working with the doctoral students? I know it's a big question.
Ming-Cher, I don't think there's one single answer, but I think
Right.
you've got at the core point, which is to make a conscious choice, right? Yeah. And I think for different people, it's different ways. Ollie Williamson worked with a lot of doctoral students. And for the most part, those were students who were working with him to help him develop transaction cost theory.
Right.
And transaction cost theory is stronger as a result of the fact that, Joanne Oxley and lots of others worked with Ollie to help develop it. But it was very much around his mission, his vision of what his theory was, and the doctoral students were partners in that, but it was Ollie at the center of it. And he's stunningly successful. And for some of us, that's the right choice. Others, and I think I probably put myself in this camp, start with what's the idea that the doctoral student has and how can we develop it? And there's some things I can help with and some things I can't. So there's some of me in there as well, because as much as I find all sorts of things interesting, there's some I just don't know enough about and can't get up speed fast enough to help with. So, the better dissertations are the ones where there's at least some linkage to what I've done and do. But for the most part, I've tried to take the doctoral students' ideas at the center and see where I can help push that. And if I think about Lena, your dissertation, Samina, your dissertation, Xiaoshu, your dissertation, those are three very different pieces of work. And the cool things that have come out of them are very different. And I'd like to think I played some role in that, but you're the primary drivers of that, and have been. So you make a choice. And for some reason, just for some folks, the right choice is I'm not going to work with doctoral students, because you either have to do it fully or not at all, right? Because frankly, you screw up somebody's life if you dabble at it, and it is that fundamental. Because this is, as every one of us in this room know, dissertation and the doctoral program is a life-changing event. It literally does change the way you think. It changes the way you look at the world. It takes one set of eyeballs out of your head and puts another set of eyeballs in. And if you're going to engage with somebody in the process of that surgery and that mental change, you damn well better be committed to it. And if you don't want to be committed to it, that's fine, because there's an infinite number of things we can do in our careers. Do something else, but don't do it halfway.
I think in a way, I think you also raise another very important question, is that so you have this big research program, and then all the doctoral students will play a role in this big research program. And then another question is, I also have colleagues, will completely go with the student's interest and then let the student interest to drive, his or her interest. And versus another extreme is, if the student want to work with me, that you have to study the kind of research question that I'm interested in. So that's one issue. Mm-hmm. Another issue, I for instance, like I spoke to Don Hembrick, and who is also known, in developing the future scholars. And then even several years ago, he already told me that he would not take more students because he cannot make 5 years the commitment and given the phase of his career. And then suddenly he told me this time that no, he has another doctorate student, so he will commit another 5 years. So I think so the question could be something like, I think your point is very well taken. So unless you can truly help and work with the student through the process, you would not take a student. And
we have the luxury. I mean, this is one of those lovely things where even if you change schools, and some of us do, you can keep working with a student. I've demonstrated that. Even if you retire, I haven't retired yet, but I know faculty who have retired who keep working with students. You know, Al Chandler was working on research till the day he died. Ollie Williamson was working on research till the day he died. You know, so long as you keep at least some of your faculties, you can stay engaged. You know, whether it's in a different school, whether it's emeritus, whatever.
Well, Elena needed to step away for just a few minutes. So if it's okay, I'm going to continue with the Q&A. We have a question from Tria Cathley. Tria, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Samina. So my question to you, Will, is what advice do you have for someone who is just starting out, you know, who is in the exploration phase, who is trying to identify the knowledge gap in the academics? Because I've just completed my master's. I'm not even a doctoral student yet, but I know that I want to get into the strategy field. But every time I read something and I have an idea, I feel like someone else has already worked on that. So how do you identify that innovation in the academics? So thank you.
Yeah. So I think I mentioned this before. One thing I've started doing the last couple of years is these gaps tables, where I'm actually doing that with co-authors now, relatively early in projects, to say here's the broad space I'm interested in, and then try to narrow it down, and it gives some definition to what I'm working on, and then drill down as hard as you can. What are the related set of concepts that are relevant for the question you care about? Within that related set of concepts, what have people already said and know? And where are the gaps? And there's always going to be gaps. And then you have to make a decision on whether the gaps are big enough or interesting enough, or you want to push them enough to be worth going after. And at this stage, do that multiple times. I mean, I think of a PhD program as the first 1.5 or 2 years is exploration. In some sense, it's shopping, right? It's going into a bunch of different stores, trying on theories, trying on methods, trying on questions, seeing which ones fit, which ones don't fit, which ones resonate, which ones you like the way they feel, which ones when other people look at them they think they fit you as well, and then roughly 1.5 years in, 2 years in, buying and saying, you know, this is what I'm going to do this station on. And so it makes sense in that first couple of years to really try on a bunch of ideas. And something like the gaps table may help with that, because it forces you to say, this is the question, here are the concepts that are relevant for the question, here's the people and literatures that have talked about those concepts. This is what they know, this is what they don't know. Is what they don't know something I want to engage with to help fill that gap? And so, you know, try doing that multiple times. But I don't think that goes away. As I said earlier, we're all junior scholars, right? So whether you're doing it at the very beginning of a PhD program, or whether you're doing it, you know, 38 years into a PhD program, it's still the same thing.
And I think Ziyan had a kind of a good follow-up question to that. Ziyan, do you want to do your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Elena. And nice to meet you here. And thanks. And I also learned a lot from working with you. So my question goes to you is, for a junior scholar, what do you see as important for them? But not all junior scholars actually notice that importance. So do you have something in mind like this from a backward-looking perspective?
Yeah, I'm sort of useless at looking backwards. It's a random walk, and I can make up logic, but it doesn't really mean much. It's just ex post. I mean, and this is going to sound really general and really, but pick something you care about and work on it.
Yeah.
And do your damnedest to convince relevant parts of the world that it matters. Don't expect the world to believe you, you know, when you say it matters the first time or second time or third time. You know, think about what we've been going through with the reviews on the institutional intermediation paper. You know, we're beginning to get to the point where people believe us, but boy, it's been a lot of work.
Yep.
But if we give up, they're not going to believe us. So, you know, it's our job to keep making the case for this matters.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, thanks, Bill.
On a more specific talk, I have a more specific question, I guess. I was in a PDW where, and one junior scholar said, I think Samina was there too. We were talking about editors and journals and how some journals are asking authors to actually put down the name of potential editors or potential reviewers. And one junior scholar said, I never do that because I assume that the senior editor knows best. I had a different impression from that, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on this more specific question. Should a junior scholar put down who you think the reviewers and editors should be, or no?
Absolutely, yes. And as you know, you should also cite those people in the first 2 paragraphs of the paper. And if you find yourself putting down an editor and reviewers who you haven't cited, there's something wrong with the way you built the logic in the paper. So make sure you go put them, and don't just sort of add them to the end of the string of reviews. Make sure that the paper actually builds around their work. I mean, I've edited roughly 3,000 papers at SMJ, and then lots of others at other journals. I think I track them, so I've written something over 3,000 decision letters at SMJ, the way I pick reviewers is I first read the first couple paragraphs to see what body of work that people are engaging with, and I try to pick somebody who's there or somebody who's related to who's there. But I could miss it, or you may have an idea that you forgot to put there, or maybe it showed up better elsewhere. And so, you know, tell me who you know, just as it's your responsibility of the audience, it helps to decide on who the audience is. Tell me who the audience is. I can agree or disagree. And sometimes, you know, I'll look at somebody and say, you know, you think that person's going to be the right person, but I think you're wrong because I've seen lots of reviews from them and they look at things in different ways. And who besides me has had the experience of having a really nice conversation with somebody at a conference and putting them down as a suggested reviewer, or just, you know, really realizing that they've shown up as a reviewer and realizing that they're looking at it in very, very different ways than I wish they had looked at it.
Same, is that a question, or have you done that?
I'm strongly agreeing.
It's my job as an editor to be a partner with you to figure out who thoughtful set of reviewers are. Not an easy set of reviewers. A tough-minded set of reviewers who will take the question from your point of view. But you can help me with that.
And I think on a related note, I think Renata had a question about topic. Renata?
Hello.
Hey,
yes,
Renata.
the question was actually asked already before, like 2 or 3 people before me, like kind of when is the topic, how do I know that the topic really is worth investigating? But I think you answered that already with your answer with the Excel sheet and the columns.
Yeah, and just, you know, to reinforce that slightly, talk about the topic several times in conferences and workshops.
Mm-hmm.
And you may discover that you just cannot find a way to get people to resonate. You know, and at some point it's where, you know, be compulsive and obsessive and stick to but sometimes you just give up. But for the most part, you learn what the language is that will get people to connect to it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think a good exercise that Will also always made us do was to write a first paragraph of what we think that paper would be. And that was always a good exercise, just to like mentally, okay, if I had to write a paper about this, how would I put this into like 4 sentences? Will, do you want to talk a little bit about your 4 sentences? I think some people here may already know them.
Yeah, I won't belabor it, but you know, the first sentence is, what's the question? Which is and great first sentences have both a dependent variable and an independent variable in them, right? You know, how does X affect Y? Or how does Y affect X, depending on your logic. So that right off the bat, people know sort of what realm you're in. And then the second sentence is, I think of as it's a 2-parter with the audience and the conventional wisdom. Who are the scholars that I want to talk to that have thought about that question in the first sentence? And what have they concluded? And so now by the second sentence, I know who I'm talking to, and I've read the literature well enough to know what the conventional wisdom is in that part of the literature. And then third sentence is, what does that group of people not know? And said in a way that that they'll agree that they don't know it. And then the fourth sentence is, what am I going to argue that will help fill part of the gap that they don't know? And you know, those of you who've done this with me know how hard this is and how many times you write it. I'm just before this call, I was working on editing a paper, the final edits of a paper that we're going to send off for review as soon as I finish these edits. And I'm changing words in the first paragraph again. And we have written this, I don't want to think about how many times we've written this. I'll tell the story. Some of you, Elena, you took a class with George Gopin, right? George is a lawyer. He's a member of the English faculty at Duke. He has a theory of writing that is a reader-based view of writing, and it changed the way I write, because I used to think that the important stuff was what you started with, and George says no, the important stuff is what you end with. The last word of a sentence, the last sentence of a paragraph, the last paragraph of a section. What you start with sets people up, but what people take away is where you end. And George did a study a bunch of years ago where he took a bunch of papers that had been rejected by English journals and changed one thing in half of them and sent them back out again to new journals. And by whatever norms of reliability English scholars judge, he got a differential acceptance rate on the papers where he had changed the one thing. And the one thing he changed was the last sentence in the first paragraph, which, for me is, this is the argument I'm going to make in this paper that fills the gap that we talked about earlier in this paragraph. And how many of us have reviewed? How many of us have got to the end of the first paragraph or the end of the introduction and already decided that we're going to reject the paper, and the rest of the reading is looking for reasons to reinforce why we're going to reject the paper? And so if you lose the reader in the first paragraph, you will never get them back. So, and just be really, really clear in that first paragraph, and sentence next paragraph is important because it sort of does some framing. The last paragraph in the introduction is really important because it says these are the contributions. And it's not a laundry list of 8 things, it's 2 or 3 things that are closely related to each other. Then, if you do that, you get a chance at least to get, at least you get the reviewer engaged enough to say, well, let's see whether they can deliver. And you got to get the rest of it right too. But the longer you can keep them engaged, the setup in the first paragraph in the introduction, then the logic, whether it's a research question or the background, your explanation of the literature in the theory section or the background section, and then the logic you use for research questions or hypotheses, I've got to hold, and then the research design has to make sense, and you can lose them at every one of those points. But the farther you can get in, unless you really hit a fatal flaw, the more likely you are to get an R&R. For somebody to say, well, okay, you've got me convinced, but I see some issues with the logic, but you can fine tune the logic. Or you've got me convinced, I've got through the logic, I see some issues with the research design, but if you can solve those, we can move ahead with it. Or if you're really lucky, you've got all the way through, and now we're into the discussion section, and I disagree with one of the implications you're drawing, but we can fine tune that. You're not going to get rejected in the discussion section. You might get rejected in the first paragraph. So it's worth just a little bit of time and effort.
So I think the conversation now, it's about specific papers, but Nikisha had a question about the pipeline in general. Nikisha, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for this opportunity. And so I was wondering, I'm a first-year PhD student at Baruch College, and I work with Elena Vidal. So thank you for all the great things that you've worked on with her. And one of the things that we talk about in terms of just setting us up for a career in academia is just building a strategy for a strong pipeline of research papers. And I was just wondering if you had any strategies that you use to kind of keep your pipeline full, especially when you were focused on getting tenure and being out on the market.
Yeah. So first off, just taking the last point, I don't think I've ever focused on getting tenure. I think getting tenure is a secondary outcome of being engaged in the field. You know, through your publications, through your through your teaching, through workshops and seminars and conferences and the like. It's something that, you know, we get tenure means we can keep on doing what we've always been doing. So I've never really, I mean, I care about tenure because it means I can keep on doing what I've always been doing, but it's not the goal. The goal is to do things. And maybe one way to think about it is every few years start another dissertation. You know, do a piece of dissertation work. You know, get several ideas out of it that ideally turn into some combination of publishable ideas and workshop presentations, conference presentations. So partly for yourself so that you can get a core set of ideas that you understand how things fit together, partly for the field so that the field sees how your ideas fit, you know, that there's some coherence to your ideas, that it's not just a whole bunch of stuff that happens to show up on a CV. And that takes time, right? I mean, we were talking earlier about projects that can take 9 years or 12 years or 15 years or whatever the number is. You know, tenure clocks are faster than 50, even slow tenure clocks. I think there may be some tenure clocks that are 10. There's certainly not, and there's some as low as 6. There's certainly, or 5 or 4. There's some, none that I know of that are 15. So while you're getting, taking, and our field, you know, for many of us, our field is a combination of empirics and theory, right? There are some fields where it's just empirics. There's some fields where it's just theory. It's faster to get stuff out because there's more focus. All of us who've gone through review know how hard it is to get all the reviewers and the editor lined up on the theoretical contribution or for at least framing, on the empirical, on the research design. It just takes us time. And there's no way around that, given the field we're in. And fields change a bit over time, but not that much. So so while you're still, you know, busting your tails to sort of figure out the connections and get the pieces out, start another dissertation quality piece of research. And occasionally it can be completely different than what you did the first time around. More often it's going to be related in some way. You take the stuff you learned from the first projects and get intrigued by something else and start something else, possibly with a doctoral student, possibly on your own, possibly with a colleague. I don't think that choice matters that much. It's a choice you need to make, but it can be anyone. But just basically keep doing pieces of research that are worth spending the 2 to 3 to 4 years that it takes to get the dissertation to the point that you can start publishing things from it.
So following up on that, Rich, before he left, he had asked a question if you were starting all over as a doctoral student today, what dissertation would you do now? And I think it's still relevant since you do dissertations every so often. So what would be the next topic that you would choose? Or
no, I mean, one topic I'm just beginning to work on now with Kawant and with Naveed is on how does the fact that political openness can go forward and back and market openness can go forward and back, sometimes at the same time, sometimes in off diagonals within countries, and how does that affect business strategy? Now that's just that I happen to find that interesting, and I have some data on. I have some data on market openness that I've been built on a sort of a structure that I built that I now have about 15, almost 20 years of data, about 15 years of data, and I have some data on political openness from The Economist, so that which I can track over about 15 years. So I've got reasonably good data on how those trend, and it's actually just unambiguous that they can both go forward and go back, and that you can have one go forward and another one go back. You know, Hungary is a good example. It's gone back on political openness. It's actually gone forward on market openness. And so I'm intrigued. That's just, but that's me. You know, Rich asked what I would do. That's pretty. That might be what I would work on in a dissertation. But you know, whatever you find intriguing and believe you can convince others is intriguing. I remember when I started my PhD program, I was at the top. I remember sort of setting up for our first welcome orientation session at the top floor of Barrows Hall, and one of the students, not in strategy, I forget which field, maybe in operations, came in and said, he was really depressed because he discovered that all the questions had been answered. There was nothing new to answer, and he was just really depressed. And in fact, he quit about 6 months in because he just couldn't find anything new. But he's wrong. I mean, can you think about operations right now? Are there open questions in operations on July 27th or July 27th, 2020? Could you imagine doing a dissertation on global supply chains in July 2020? You know, whether it was a model or an empirical paper, and lots of other things. Or, you know, just imagine all the stuff that's happened in just in time and what we learned about making just in time work or when it doesn't work and that sort of thing. There's always questions. The world changes, and it changes in unanticipated ways. Sometimes those changes even work in your favor. I was doing a paper with Pasha and Siddharth on banking in India. And we'd got all the way through. We had the data, we had the analysis. It was, you know, it wasn't identified. You know, it was a good correlational study. And then after we had all the data up and had all the logic in place and had tested all the hypotheses, Prime Minister Modi decided to kill the 50 rupee and 1,000 rupee bills, and it was a completely exogenous shock, unambiguously a completely exogenous shock. And it turned out it was dead relevant to one of our hypotheses. So we used that shock to test, you know, to add a supplemental test of our hypothesis. That's fun. I don't obsess about identification, but believe me, when it shows up in my lab, I'll take advantage of it.
Asim, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Although now I'm looking very suspiciously at Will as like, how much did he pay Modi to get this change done? Anyway. So Will, since we're talking about change and, you know, you've been co-editor of SMJ, you're a board member at SMS. What are some of the changes you've seen in the field of strategy over the years that on the one hand, you know, you think are very exciting and two, are there things you're concerned about?
Yeah, so let me start with the core. So the SMS version of strategy has always taken the position that we were allowed to study causally complex questions, right? And think about many of the questions in strategy. Could you tease them apart so that they were fully identified and completely separate and separate them out in a way that you trusted the separation, that you hadn't had to get rid of something that really mattered? And so really from the beginning, and this is really Schendel-Hofer, then Schendel, Thies, Rammelt, the SMS, the journal, it's always taken the position that we're allowed to study questions where you're probably not going to get an unambiguous answer with one study, but if we do enough studies, we can triangulate and get reasonably comfortable with what's going on. And I've sometimes used the example of acquisition studies for that. I can't imagine doing one study in acquisitions that fully explains even one important thing in acquisitions. But I can imagine doing, several hundred, 1,000 studies in acquisitions, that when you put them together, you get a pretty robust understanding of what's going on with acquisitions. And that's the right of our field. Now, we've become more sophisticated over time in demands for framing, you know, call it theory if you like, but demands for framing. There was a time when you could do fairly loosey-goosey empirical stuff where you talked to a bunch of people and then wrote it up and it got published and it got cited a lot. And I'm not going to name names, but one of the most cited papers in SMJ is like that. It's just, you know, somebody talked to 11 executives, wrote it up, said that he knew more about it than the executives did because he had more perspective on it, and was highly accepted as you know, as a really interesting, strong piece of research at the time. It would be really hard to publish that now. Close to impossible. We've become much more aware of the value of longitudinal work. We don't demand it, but we'll push pretty hard to take advantage of longitudinal opportunities because you see things change over time. We're much more sophisticated about qualitative methods than we used to be, and we still fight about which qualitative method is right. And that's probably the biggest flaw in that field, is that there's 6 or 8 or 10 different ways of doing qualitative work, and the reviewers spend more time beating each other up on their approach to qualitative work than they do on the work itself. And I wish I was exaggerating, but I'm not. But we actually have become much more sophisticated about thinking about how to structure qualitative work. We've learned how to take identification seriously. And we're pretty good, at least in the SMS part, SMJ, SEJ, GSJ part of the world, of saying, if identification is appropriate and possible, do it. If it's not appropriate and possible, it's okay, but you have to be really honest about the boundaries of what you're finding and push yourself hard. Or whether it's with instruments, whether it's with diff and diff, whether it's through Rajanans and Gallus, places where things should hold, places where things shouldn't hold. We've become a lot more sophisticated about pushing the boundaries, at least, of causality, without falling into the trap of saying it has to be causal. And we've adopted some field experiments without forcing it, without allowing it to take over the field. And there are some fields where, if it's not a field experiment, you can't publish. We've avoided falling into that trap. And then you think about probably the one social science theory that I think has any explanatory power, has really strong explanatory power, is the theory of imprinting, right? What happens early has a really, really big impact on on how things continue. And Dan Schendel, with his sort of vision of what SMJ would be, and the others working with him, but Dan especially at the center of that, really created that environment in which we could pursue causally complex questions. And then over time, as we become more of a discipline in a field, and I think we are a discipline now rather than a field, rather than a collection of ideas from other disciplines, we've become a lot more disciplined about as I said, about our framing and about our methods. But and that continues to evolve. But most of us, Asim, you've been involved in the debates about identification, right? And we have fought the identification wars, and so far we're still winning. And it is a fight, right? Because there are folks who just fundamentally believe that if it ain't identified, it ain't real, and it can't be published. And but if you think about it, going from Dan through Ed and Rich and me, through Connie and Alfonso and Sendel, there's been a pretty strong thread, and that's the SMJ part. And then think about the editors that have gone through it, that have taken leadership roles at SMJ, and SEJ, and GSJ. There's a really common theme there of being disciplined rather than discipline bound, if that distinction makes any sense. Rather than saying there's only one way of doing research, of saying there's multiple ways of doing research, and we're going to beat you up on them because you've got to be really tight about them. But there are different ways of, and it starts with a question, and then find a way to do a research design that makes sense for your question.
So one question that Rich had asked that I think it's also relevant for this is, I remember having this conversation with you when I was a doctoral student of like how much to care about identification versus that balance of, is it really identified, but it's an important question that you can identify, or is the question more important? But more generally, what is the one advice that you give your doctoral students that is more important than anything else?
I don't know. I've got multiple doctoral students. Let me turn that around. Shashu, if there's one piece of advice that I gave or didn't get, or that sort of emerged in some sort of emergent way that was useful, what was it?
Well, on the top of my mind, I just really resonate with what you said. Like when we do the presentation, we go through the research question and everything and the logic, and we realize things that we couldn't identify like before. Well, we have been working on that, and I really I just feel like during my practice talks, like for my dissertation, you raised a lot of very good questions as well, like during the talk. I think those are super valuable.
Okay, Samina, what about you?
I very clearly remember this, and I've passed it down to many others. When I was a junior scholar and the pressures of tenure were upon me, and there's so many things that you have no control over at your institutions and things, you said, keep your head down and get your work done. And that's been advice I've followed. I tell myself that all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've had conversations with deans where deans tell me this is the type of work I'd like you to do. And I tell them, this is that's irrelevant. This is the work I'm going to do. And I can do it here or I can do it somewhere else. I don't really care. But this is the work I'm going to do. Z, I mean, you weren't my doctoral student, but we worked together closely. Is there anything comes to mind to you?
Yeah, so I was most impressed when I received the R2R table and the gap table from UView. So it totally changed my view of how to do this kind of R&R process. So I was always thinking about writing first and then write the response letter, but you fundamentally change how I should do the R&R. So this is most valuable for me, yeah, in terms of getting thoughts from you.
Yeah, this I've been doing for a few years now. You know, taking every review and again 3 columns. One column I just copy in the full comment. The second comment I summarize it down to a few words so that I really know what they're asking. And then the third column I write a draft of how I'm going to respond. And then we do this. You know, as he says, we'll cycle this around the authors because it really helps figure out what they're asking and figure out a roadmap before either ignoring something or just answering the wrong question. Lena, what about you? What did you take away?
The 4 sentences. To me, it's always been, it just provided such a structure that, I don't know, I always feared this, I don't know, I think it helped me through a couple of things. One was, you know, you're starting this big project that it's a dissertation or this big paper and facing a blank piece of Word document and not knowing where to start was just very overwhelming. And it just narrowed it down to something that was very manageable. It was like, just focus on this 4 sentences. And that created, you know, it was like, I stopped staring at a blank document. I just had something to go on and it allowed me to think about, okay, so from this, if this is what I'm gonna try to do in this last sentence, this is the gap of the paper, this is my contribution. It just created a whole, I could see the plan of what the paper would look like. And I think for me that it was advice that if I have a new idea, that's where I always start, the first paragraph. And at least for me, it helped me overcome some of the fears of having to write something.
Yeah.
So for me, it was great advice. I also remember somebody else, it wasn't you, but this was some funny and good advice that somebody said while I was a PhD student, and they said, it's better to keep your mouth shut and be thoughtful than to open it up and confirm it. So I always thought that was an interesting tidbit of information. But it also helped me think about, okay, so I have to have my head clear on that 4 sentence, because if that's clear, then I'm not going to make a fool of myself.
Yeah. So let me push on that a bit. Can we survive in this career without opening our mouths?
Probably not.
I'll take the probably out. Right? We make our career partly through what we publish. And even publishing, I don't think you can do without opening your mouth. But even imagine you could publish papers without opening your mouth, just sort of sitting in your office, writing them, and revising them, and eventually getting them accepted. We really get known in the profession, and our ideas move, and we begin a position in the profession, largely through the interactions we have with people at conferences and workshops and seminars and the like. And if you just sit in a seminar and never say anything, you're invisible. So, and this is risky, you know, because as you say, you open your mouth, there is a risk that somebody will think you're a fool. And there's occasionally times when people open their mouths too much, or just really keep pushing on one thing that's dead. That, you know, the point has been made and it keeps getting made over and over and over again, which sort of loses power. But part of developing ourselves in the profession is, you know, learning how to be engaged in a conversation.
And I think Rich had asked us a question about this, that you know, one of the things that I think we keep getting, especially as doctoral students, it's mostly about how do you actually do the research, and it's less so about some of the softer skills that you need in terms of like, do I want this person to be a colleague? I think we have to think of ourselves as more than just the researcher, but also as a scholar. So Rich had asked some question about, you know, what makes a good colleague, and, you know, who's a good colleague that, you know, would be a good role model for us to follow?
Anybody who's open-minded and engaged. I mean, and you know, and I'm not going to name names because this is being recorded, but those of you at Duke have spent time at Duke know one faculty member who you originally come away from being really scared of, and then over time you realize how powerful and valuable he is. Lena, do you know who I'm talking about?
Yep.
And because he's engaged, and because he takes an author point of view, scholar point of view. Those are good colleagues. But you know, coming back to the opening your mouth, I was at the first Triple C in Carnegie, and it was about a year before I was coming up for tenure. I was going to have to put together a list of 12 people who were going to be that the school would send letters to, and I looked around the room and I realized that 10 of the 12 were there. You know, and so I mentally had a choice: do I keep my mouth shut and you know, and hope that they don't get angry at me, or do I shoot my mouth off? And I'm constitutionally incapable of not opening my mouth, so I shut it off. But it was also, it's truly glorious when you're in an environment where 10 of the people who you want to be peers with, or want to at least aspire to contribute to the conversation with, are there. And so take the opportunity to engage in the conversation. Do it respectfully, obviously, but be engaged in it.
And following up from that, I think Richard also asked a similar question. He just changed one word, but I think it's relevant, especially for me at this stage where I just got to become an associate and I'm transitioning into actually working more heavily with students. I think some of us had a great role model in you as to what is a good PhD advisor and mentor, but what would make a good mentor in your view, and why? And can you think of somebody who would be a good mentor?
Well, I think it's an attribute. I actually don't like the word mentor, because mentor creates an image to me of somebody on their knees looking up at somebody else. I prefer to think of it as master craftspeople and apprentices. And I think of doctoral students as apprentices, right? And I think about an apprenticeship program is. You go in and you start doing the work. And you start out with simple skills, simple tasks, and as you gain experience with those, you take on more complex tasks. And at some point, you get to the point where you know as much as the master crafts person, and in many cases more. And then in turn, you become a master crafts person who's in a position of continuing to hone his or her skills. So for me, someone who's good to work with is someone who will make sense of what skills you have, will put you to work on things that will help you learn new skills, and then will keep advancing the work you do as you get the base. I don't want to work with people who just leave you stuck in doing scut work for 3 or 4 years because that's that helps them. Nor do I want to work with somebody who throws you into the deep end too much and gets really frustrated because you're not capable of doing what you haven't learned how to do yet. And it has to be somebody who's going to spend time talking with you or communicating with you in one way or another. And every communication is different. Each different communication channel is different. But I do think of it as an apprenticeship role. For a PhD student, when's the right time to start a research project? Day one. Because if you wait till the 3rd year after you've done the comps to start figuring out how to do research, it's 2 to 3 years too late. And will the first projects be messy? Yep. Will they break? Yep. On the other hand, Olga and I started that project with Dow Jones as the first project, and damn it actually got published about a year ago. Or think about the project, Elena, that we started on institutional intermediation with incubators.
Oh yeah.
Which took a long time. And started out messy, and started out as a red state, not even so much a red state paper as just a red paper with very little theory in it, just about incubators. And then over time, it evolved to being an institutional intermediation paper. Really, it's actually a blue state paper around institutional intermediation that actually became really cool. And I learned a lot from it. I know Ronnie has told me he learned a lot from it. Anita has told me she learned a lot from it. I hope that you and Nell and Olga learned something from it. But
absolutely.
But that process of you know, Anita, Ronnie, and I knew more than you did at the beginning, but we still had huge gaps in what we knew. So it really was a team, and we got to a really cool place.
It was definitely a learning experience from all the different angles of on working on that paper, through the transition from red to blue, to going through the review process, to just working with you and Anita and Ronnie. It was, and my two cohort mates. I think that really brought us even closer together. So on that note, I think I'll pass it on to Samina, who has a couple more questions.
All right, I have some fun questions, Will, that I've been asking folks, but I have one serious question before my fun question, which is there something you know now that you wish you had known when you were a junior scholar?
No, I don't think so. I'm still figuring it out.
Okay, good, that gives us all hope. Okay, all right, so here's a quick fire questions. Do you have a favorite dessert?
Whatever's on the table.
Okay. You've probably traveled the world. Do you have a favorite city?
The next one I'm going to.
Would you prefer mountains or oceans?
Oh, I picked BC, that way I get both.
Good answer. Do you, when you're not reading scholarly work, do you read fiction or nonfiction?
Both, actually. I've just finished Margaret Atwood's last book. I read a bunch of bad science fiction, a bunch of noir, Scandinavian murder mysteries. But you know, nonfiction is fun as well.
And I can't even imagine how busy you are, but when you want to relax or unwind, what do you do?
Oh, we talked about this earlier. Listen to baseball and put up data sets.
And ride your motorcycle? No?
Motorcycle, unfortunately, is in North Carolina right now, and if I went, I could get into the U.S. on my U.S. passport, but then I'd have to quarantine for 2 weeks when I came back to Canada.
Thank you so much, Will, for giving us 2 hours of your time. And on behalf of the division, I want to thank you for making this time. And I'm going to turn it over to Elena for final words.
Not too many final words other than thank you everybody for attending, and thank you, Will, for your time, not just now, but I think as a member of the field in general. I think you're so generous with your time, not just with your doctoral students, but with all doctoral students and PDWs and all the things that you do. I think somebody has said, you know, you said that one of the major constraints that we have is time, and you're so, even in those constraints, you're so generous with it. So thank you so much for your time here and for your time, you know, in the field.
Yeah, and let me conclude by thanking those of you from STR, the leadership in STR, Samina, Seem, Elena, others. What you're doing is just stunningly valuable. We have, and it's valuable intellectually, we learn more, and just pragmatically, it's valuable in terms of our careers. We have our careers only because we have this field. Or we have the nature of the field, the careers we have is because of this field, right? Some of us probably could have chosen to be economists, or some of us could have chosen to be org theorists. Be hugely different careers. We'd study different questions, we'd engage with different people, we'd use different methods, we'd come up with different insights, we would teach different things. In a real sense, we would be different people, in a meaningful sense. And the fact that we've created this field and that you're continuing to shape this field and grow this field really gives us an identity as who we are, and in a really deep way. And I really deeply appreciate the fact that you're doing this work.
Thank you. Thanks, Will.
Cool.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Have a great rest of the day or evening, wherever it is you are. Bye.
Enjoy. Stay safe.
Bye, Will.
Wear masks.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.